So good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Albert Roy, the Executive Director of Lupus Therapeutics, the clinical trial innovation affiliate of the Lupus Research Alliance. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Lupus Therapeutics, our mission is to accelerate lupus drug development by forging partnerships with lupus scientists, pharmaceutical industry, and people living with lupus. I think all of us can agree that ensuring that clinical research works for patients, that is, putting the patient at the center of what we do, has always been the goal for designing lupus clinical trials. But COVID-19 has forced us all to rethink how taking part in a clinical trial can impact people with lupus, and it has reaffirmed the critical need for well-designed, patient-centric clinical trials. And that is a good thing because the necessity for change has forced us to rethink where we go next. Over the course of the next hour, we are going to explore some very important considerations regarding how patient care and lupus clinical trials are conducted during the pandemic. We are going to touch on a myriad of topics, such as what are the perceptions and attitudes of people with lupus about joining a clinical trial during the pandemic? What are the key barriers to clinical trial participation? What technological innovations are being used to make studies more patient-friendly? And what role can patients play in redefining lupus clinical trials of the future? In preparation for this webcast, we conducted a survey and received responses from more than 300 people with lupus in the United States and Canada. To help turn these insights into innovation, we have brought together an amazing panel. We have two representatives from the pharmaceutical industry working on lupus clinical trials, and a physician who is the incoming president of the American College of Rheumatology, sees hundreds of people with lupus. We also have a renowned expert in clinical trial innovation who brings the very latest thinking on how trial design is adapting and what technologies are emerging in response to the pandemic. Most importantly, we have two incredible women with lupus who will share their perspectives and their experiences. So without further ado, let's meet our panel. Ms. Chanel Gabriel is a longtime supporter of the Lupus Research Alliance. Chanel has many, many talents. She's a singer, she's a poet, she's a lyricist, and most importantly, she's a fierce advocate for lupus awareness. She has also participated in past clinical trials and will speak about her experiences in that regard. Ms. Molly McCabe co-funded the former Molly's Fund for Fighting Lupus after she was diagnosed with lupus. She has become one of the most active members within the lupus community and serves on the Lupus Research Alliance Board of Directors. Dr. David Karp is Chief of Rheumatic Diseases Division at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center and President-elect of the American College of Rheumatology. Dr. Karp directs both laboratory and clinical research on lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. Mr. Craig Lipset is a recognized leader at the forefront of innovation and clinical research and medicine development. Craig is the founder of Clinical Innovation Partners, and in his free time teaches health informatics at Rutgers University and the University of Rochester. Previously, Craig served as the head of clinical innovation at Pfizer. Dr. AJ Narula is vice president of immunology at Lilly Biotechnology and Research Laboratories. Before joining Lilly more than 5 years ago, Dr. Narula held similar leadership positions at Amgen and Biogen IDEC, where he was involved in several research programs for potential drugs to treat autoimmune diseases, including lupus. And Dr. Shalabh Singhal is the executive director, development program lead in immunology and fibrosis at Bristol Myers Squibb. Previously, Dr. Singhal was the clinical lead for a drug currently being studied for lupus, lupus nephritis, and other related autoimmune conditions. Before we get started, I want to thank those of you who submitted questions during the webcast registration process. We have tried to incorporate as many of those questions as possible, and if time permits, we will answer questions that come through on the online chat. So let's delve in. So there are a number of themes that were elucidated from the survey, and many of those related around patient perspectives on clinical trials in light of the pandemic. So I want to begin with Chanel and Molly, who are here to share their perspectives as people living with lupus. You both have taken the survey we conducted about attitudes towards clinical trials during the pandemic, and I believe you both have participated in at least one clinical trial before. In the survey we conducted, 3/4 of the respondents cited COVID-19 exposure risk at the medical center that they're seen at as the biggest concern when considering participating in a clinical trial. So Chanel, let's begin with you and then we'll follow with Molly. would you consider participating in a clinical trial right now? And if so, why? And if not, what options or steps should be offered by clinical trial centers to alleviate patients' concerns related to COVID-19?
I would definitely say that right now it is a nerve-wracking thing. I mean, it's just, I live in New York City. It's nerve-wracking just getting on the train. So the idea of being in a space where it's another medical facility where people are there for multiple reasons as you're getting in to go and meet the doctor. It is pretty scary to have to walk past the ER, walk past people lined up outside waiting for COVID tests. That these are things that do make it scary unless you're in a place that is a private practice where you can go. And a lot of myself and my friends that have lupus, we're not in private practice, we're at university hospitals and things like that. So I think that those are the things that make it a little scary right now. Just in general, my anxiety just goes through the roof just when I'm around too many people. So it would be a little bit hard for me to want to go to something that's optional, something that is a choice, something that by choice I might be participating.
Right. What would alleviate your concerns to maybe make you sort of feel more comfortable moving forward and going to a medical center to be seen clinically, as well as to perhaps participate as far as COVID exposure? What would you like to see?
I think I'd have to know that there are a lot of steps for people to get into the facility. I think the thing, and I do want to also get the elephant in the room out the way. Just clinical trials itself is a scary thing, period. And so I think as much on setting what clinical trials are, how the clinical trial differs, how this will benefit me. And I'm, any space I'm in, I always start by I think I told you all I was going to start this off real, just knowing what the whole steps are, as a person of color coming off of, a Black woman particularly, coming off of thinking about all those the histories of what clinical trials have done. I need every detail before I even walk to the office. So I think as much material, information about the trial, as well as what are the safety precautions for going into the building, that would, definitely help me decide, hey, I think I could participate in this. I think I'm interested in coming in.
All right, terrific. And I think we'll delve into some of those other issues that you mentioned around clinical research in general and underserved populations in that regard. So I look forward to that with you. Molly, how about you? Would you participate in a trial now? And if so, why? And if not, what would you want to see, sort of as far as safety concerns about seeing your physician in light of the pandemic?
I think that I would participate in the trial. I am also fearful of going to hospitals and medical centers just due to COVID. But I also realize that my participation in a clinical trial isn't just about me. It's about everyone else that I could be helping by participating in that trial. You also get state-of-the-art medical care when you participate in a trial, and I think that's a big asset. I would want to know that all the safety procedures were being done at every facility I go to. But there are lots of opportunities these days to do trials in a different way during COVID. We could use telemedicine appointments, get lab work done at home, technological advances that may allow us to get our data to the study researchers without even having to leave our homes.
Yeah, and so you hit on some very important topics that I'm glad you did, because we'll have the opportunity to sort of hear from our colleagues on the call what they're doing in that respect. So let me pivot quickly to David to stay on this theme, Dr. Karp. What are some of the things you are hearing from patients that you see at UT Southwestern? Are they similar or different between patients and physician perspectives with respect to patient safety and coming back to the clinic for routine care, as well as even to participate in clinical trials?
Al, we haven't really seen that many people being afraid to come to the medical center for clinical trials. And I think, we are a nation that's very heterogeneous in many ways. And in terms of COVID-19, it's just as heterogeneous. Here in Dallas, we've just sort of come off the backside of our surge, and numbers are coming down. they're still high in other parts of the country. So I think the first thing you have to recognize is, what's it like in your part of the country? How likely are you going to be in a place where you might be exposed to COVID-19, coming to the doctor in general or coming to a clinical trial? But that being said, the academic medical center is actually one of the safest places you could be in town as far as getting COVID-19. I looked at some numbers last week, and in Dallas County overall, we've had 1 out of 40 people develop COVID-19. At our medical center with 19,000 employees, it's been 1 out of 80, which still sounds like a lot. But if you look at the numbers, those are people, our employees, who got it from their relatives, their friends, somewhere else in the community. The number of people who have gotten COVID-19 here at the medical center from a patient to an employee transmission, which is about the same as I would expect for patient-to-patient transmission, is very, very small. Less than 10 people since the beginning of the pandemic. So we think it's very, very safe. And to the point about how safe is it? What do? We make sure everybody knows that they can't come into the medical center unless they are screened a day before their visit, and it doesn't matter whether that visit is a clinical visit or a clinical research visit. They get a call from my coordinator, and they have to answer that they haven't had a fever in the last 3 weeks. They haven't been exposed to someone with COVID-19, or if they have, then there's another branch where we ask them another couple of questions and make sure that we give them plenty of time to quarantine or get over any exposure. And then when they come into the building, they have to wear a mask. They have to have their temperature taken. They get screened again. So, just like I have to wear a mask and to have my temperature taken when I come to work every day, so do all of our patients and all of our clinical trial participants. So I have found that most of my participants in our trials have been very comfortable with this once they hear what we're doing. And that has not been as big of an impediment to participating in trials as I would have thought. But there are some other issues that COVID-19 has caused, with regard to recruitment, and we can talk about that later. But in terms of safety, I think it is a matter of communication, and we've done a very good job with that, I feel.
Well, that's really encouraging to hear, and I hope that your colleagues in the field across the country have similar processes and procedures in place to deal with it. And I think as a person living with lupus, I think what you've shared is an encouraging news. So, let me sort of pose the next set of questions to some of my colleagues, Dr. Narula and Singal and Craig. As far as conditions that would sort of enhance participation in clinical trials in light of some of the concerns that were elucidated out of the survey. So, we're in the midst of this pandemic, and it seems to me, to many of us actually, that bringing the clinical trial to the patient seems like a critically important approach, right? Something that is obvious and that we should do. Our survey sort of verified some of these things. So, our survey identified that having the ability to have local labs, as Molly touched on, done at home or closer to home, more telemedicine visits versus in-person visits, and being able to complete online questionnaires or mobile app-based data capture would facilitate clinical trial participation in their minds. So Dr. Narula, not only are you overseeing the large portfolio of lupus drug development program at Lilly, I know you are overseeing a very large COVID-19 clinical trial program within Lilly. So perhaps you can share with us some of your experiences in that regard that might be, perhaps translatable to best practices for lupus clinical trials going forward. And then Shal, I'll ask you a similar question. So Dr. Narula, can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely, Al. So, I found reading the results of the survey to be quite interesting, because a lot of the issues and concerns that were highlighted in the survey really do reflect a lot of the things that we're starting to work on. But I think some of the response in the survey were quite enlightening in terms of things we need to have additional focus on. And as you mentioned, when the pandemic started early this year, we had several ongoing lupus trials, and our number one goal was to keep those trials going and try to get some answers for lupus patients. But at the same time, we started mobilizing a lot of active trials in COVID research. And actually, one synergy there is there certainly probably have been some learnings from some of the COVID work that have potentially going to help in the future with lupus trials, hopefully long after the COVID pandemic is over. I think as you think about the survey results, I mean, the big concerns as we conduct trials now, whether it's continuing lupus trials or doing COVID trials, is maintaining safety for our patients, conducting these trials with integrity so that we still get meaningful results, and then just solving some of the logistics that you need to solve. It's a very unique and difficult situation where society is locked down and our patients are in a quarantine. So just little things early in the pandemic when we were trying to do trials in New York City and patients have to ride the subway to get to their clinic, it's just not feasible, right? And then of course you have issues such as coming to clinic and some of the other folks on the call have highlighted this. It's nerve-wracking to come into a hospital where there are COVID patients. So you can take measures to try and protect patients from those who are actively exposed to COVID. But I think the bigger picture is to find other measures where we can be creative and use technology to try and find new solutions. So these include things like home visits, telehealth. We can do some of the visits, for the study. Maybe not all of them, but certainly a fair number of them via telemedicine. We can find ways of actually administering drug at home with home health visits, and then use new technologies like monitoring devices and so on. And we'll probably talk more about this in the call, but we can get pretty creative in terms of how we can optimize that.
Terrific. Dr. Singhal, can you sort of elaborate on what Dr. Narula shared as far as what approaches you're seeing at Bristol Myers Squibb and that are being responsive to some of the needs that patients sort of articulated with respect to, wanting to do things more, bringing the trial to them in a virtual environment?
I think I completely echo what AJ said. I think when this started back in March or when it did, I think we were all trying to find innovative ways to do this. Well, at least when we approach this, our number one approach is how can we help the patients we already have in the trial? Do we have an armamentarium of drugs that can benefit patients who may have COVID? And we kept safety in mind because we know that coming to the hospital is high risk. Coming to an institution may be nerve-wracking. At that time, protocols weren't in place. We did not know what to expect at that time. But we knew that not having access to research, not having access to the medication that have helped you also has significant consequences. So our number one mission early on was how do we continue to provide these drugs to patients that have continued to benefit from them, while knowing that these are experimental therapies at this point, so we need to monitor safely, reliably. So setting up home lab systems, transferring that data in a manner with high integrity, monitoring telehealth visits to make sure that patients have a point of contact that stays continuous, ensuring patients, if they have questions, they have access to all the people that they need access to. Also, these trials have to be done with high compliance with the regulatory authorities. Like Dr. Narula was saying, certain visits can certainly be replicated. We took a cold hard look at all the protocols we had, saying, what is the bare minimum we need to maintain integrity, safety, and benefit patients? And then we realized a lot of the stuff we do in protocols are nice to have, are benefits to us to answer future questions. Those we said we'll be okay to live without while we serve our patients. So we found ways to keep patients safe, convenient, keep our site staff safe, provide PPE, and as time went on, we adapted further to ensure that all the sites had measures in place for preventing transmission within their own staff, keeping them safe, and keeping patients safe as they came in. Things like PPE, COVID testing as needed, protective barriers as needed, social distancing policies were enforced through several teams in our sites. And I'm sure we'll go on to, as we continue discussing how technology has played a vital role in all of these things. But I feel sites have all trials have become patient-friendlier, site-friendlier, less burdensome across the board.
Well, that's terrific. Craig, one of the things that I think is clear is sort of adapting the new clinical trial enterprise to a more virtual and remote setting requires technology. And I can't think of anyone better to sort of articulate what's happening in that space related to that. So from your perspective, what innovative technologies are emerging to augment the conduct of clinical trials?
Thanks, Al. I think Dr. Narula hit on a great list of some of the supporting technologies. You know, when March came and COVID became the pandemic that it is now, there was an entire global pipeline of new medicines that were in clinical trials around the world. New studies ground to a halt, recruitment in existing studies by and large was put on pause, and all attention was placed on safety and drug supply, making sure that patients who were in trials were being monitored appropriately for safety, and that those that were depending on access to these medicines were able to get access. And then finally, that the researchers could continue to collect the data that was so critical for understanding how these medicines worked. As Dr. Narula pointed out, there's a list of what we would call decentralized research methods that were already available. Nobody had to go back to the lab and invent a new technology here. In fact, 17 years ago, I designed and ran the first fully remote in-home clinical trial with a new drug under an FDA's IND, the way we test medicines today. These tools existed, they just weren't being incorporated and adopted in a robust and meaningful way. Now, fortunately, the FDA and other global regulators started to produce guidance documents that are so important to the industry that give them clarity in terms of how the regulators will view the use of these technologies. And they continued to be extremely supportive. And that really drove the adoption first of using the telephone, right? The most basic of technologies. Then introducing different types of video visits, just like many of us had to use to see our providers. And while we saw that in some cases it was good, in other cases it didn't quite cut it, we see the same in a lot of our clinical trials, that in some cases we can support a visit effectively using video, and in other cases it's just not going to work. But as was mentioned earlier, other countermeasures that the research community started to use also included visiting nurses and the ability to have home health professionals go to the home, whether for blood draws or to monitor for other types of data. And we're starting to see now, as a result, more and more companies going forward, including these and more what I'd call countermeasures. No responsible researcher, investigator, regulator can start a new trial in the year 2020 that runs into 2021 without planning and anticipating that there can be more hotspots. And so many of those things that we rushed to include back in March and April, most researchers are now including in their plans going forward. That doesn't mean that every new study you sign up for is going to give you a device to capture your data and send a nurse to your home. But it means at the very least, the teams are planning for these contingencies. And these are very reasonable questions for patients to talk about with their investigators and when they're considering a study. What types of countermeasures will be available if there is another outbreak and I'm not able to come to the clinic, or the clinic staff aren't even able to get there to see me? But one last observation I'll share is patients should remember that there are a lot of great ways to participate in and support research. Observational studies and registries, opportunities that you can share data just from home, straight through to these types of interventional clinical trials of new medicines. And those clinical trials of new medicines, some take place in larger academic hospitals, and some may take place in very familiar doctor's offices, outpatient practices. And so consider the range of research opportunities when looking for that that's right for you and that makes sure that you feel comfortable and safe.
Yeah. Thank you, Craig. And thank you. I mean, I think it's encouraging to hear, what is being done, and more importantly, what will be done as this situation evolves. I think it's an untapped continuum of where clinical research will go. And it's great to hear that everybody who's part of that continuum of research, that clinical research, is thinking about it thoughtfully. I want to just touch on telemedicine because it's been brought up a couple times so far this evening. And in our survey, many lupus respondents didn't feel that telemedicine can provide the same level of care, but they want the option. And that's not surprising because it's obviously difficult to assess a swollen and tender joint through a camera or evaluate a rash per se, which many of these things that manifest themselves in our patient population. So Molly and Chanel, have you used telemedicine with your treating physician to date during the pandemic? And what do you see, if you have or haven't, as some of the advantages or disadvantages with respect to that approach? And Molly, maybe we can start with you and segue to Chanel.
Sure. I think I've used telemedicine for both my physical and mental health, and I've had great experiences thus far. I think that it's a great way to get home care in the middle of a pandemic where there are a lot of safety risks to going into a medical facility. I also think that I was impressed with, while technology took a little while to catch up to COVID, when it did, my providers were really flexible and willing to put my needs first instead of the facilities. And that was a great asset for me.
Right. Terrific. Chanel.
I think it's been great. I think that telemedicine is helpful, especially when you have diseases that require you to follow with multiple doctors. And I think that that's one thing for many of us with lupus. We don't have just one rheumatologist. We have a hematologist and a cardiologist. And so being able to also just not have to take the time to the effort and labor of going to each of these places and you know, and they speak frequently about how much loss of wages having a chronic illness is. You know, it's very, very helpful to be able to have access to my doctors. And I think I think one of the disadvantages, because I do want to speak to that, is if your doctor doesn't have a great relationship with the patient, if it's a very, you know, touch and go, like, you're okay, you need these medications, all right, bye, you know, having to build that now. And I think that that's happening as well during this period of time where people are building relationships with their patients.
And that's a silver lining in all this, right? That's perhaps another silver lining in going through this pandemic is sort of those relationships that otherwise wouldn't exist or now have to be nurtured and fostered with respect to the pandemic, right? So I think that's a good thing. Dr. Karp, you know, I'm curious. So we've heard from Molly and Chanel about telemedicine, what the good things are and the disadvantages are. What techniques do you use to make telemedicine visits more productive and patient-friendly?
Well, I think we're all learning how to make telemedicine better, because prior to COVID-19, actually, you know, telehealth was fairly regulated. I mean, it still is. We have some emergency regulatory relief that allows us to do telehealth where we couldn't do it before. And we're hoping that many of those regulations go away or are modified after the pandemic so that we can do telehealth. But a lot of us are still learning some of the best practices. You know, a lot of it has to do with sort of educating our patients as to, you know, what, you know, technology will support telehealth. I find that, you know, I do about half of my visits by telehealth now. That's what we're asked to do. And of those half of patients with telehealth, probably, you know, a third of them have problems with the technology. And, you know, maybe their internet access isn't so great. You know, Texas is a big state. We have a lot of people who live on rural, in rural places where the high-speed internet doesn't reach. And it's great for them because they don't have to drive or fly hours to see me, which they did in the past. But, you know, if I have a garbled transmission or a fuzzy transmission, that doesn't help. So getting people sort of primed for the visit so they know what to expect and they're prepared and are able to ask the questions that they want of their provider in the time that's available. Because it's also an interesting thing that in many cases, you know, we have, I won't say less time with patients, but it's a lot more structured time with patients on telehealth. Because, you know, and I'm sorry to say, if anybody has experienced sitting around and waiting for their doctor, you know, in the waiting room because they've gotten behind, you know, on my telehealth visits, you know, it's sort of like the timer is up and, you know, the 20-minute visit is over. And, you know, if I have to talk longer, I can, but, you know, there is I know that somebody else is already waiting, you know, in the next queue for me to click over to them. So we try and make them as productive, as you said, and as efficient as possible. It's tough when you have to do a physical exam by telehealth. You know, these visits work really, really well for all of my stable patients who, you know, we just have to make sure that they're not having problems with their medicines. Do they have any questions? Do they need refills, et cetera? But when somebody says, well, my foot hurts, and I'd say, well, can you show me your foot? And they're like, no, I can't show you my foot. Then that's a visit we have to then, you know, bring them into the office for.
Yeah. So just as a, thank you, Dr. Karp, just as a follow-up. So I guess the question that I would ask is, so there's all these new processes and sort of procedures and technologies to help with clinical care and clinical trials. Telemedicine, I guess, is that something here to potentially stay? And so do you see it evolving in the future and integrating or not with clinical care and clinical trial conduct?
Yes, Al, I'm pretty certain that more people are going to be doing telemedicine after the pandemic. You know, as I alluded to, a lot of this depends on our friends in Washington and as well as in you know, states across the country, because a lot of you know, medical practice is regulated by the states. And here in Texas, our governor sort of signed an emergency decree making it a lot easier to do telemedicine, whereas it was, you know, pretty difficult before that. So hopefully, you know, those things go away, and I'm sure that people are going to, you know, want to do telemedicine, both providers and patients. I mean, you know, frankly, if I was one of my patients who was stable, and I do have a lot of stable lupus patients, and I had to take off work for half a day and, you know, pay the valet to park my car and sit in the waiting room and then see Dr. Karp for 15 or 20 minutes, and then out the door I go, and then it's another drive home through, you know, terrible traffic. You know, that doesn't make my day very, very happy. Whereas if I can just, you know, turn on my computer and see Dr. Karp, and you know, in 15 minutes we've finished what we need to do for this visit, I think that's great. And that's great for me because potentially I can, you know, see more patients that way. So I think it's here to stay. And I think it's just a question of trying to get all the technology sorted out, all the regulations sorted out, getting people comfortable with this.
Yeah, no, and I'm great you brought up the technology. So Craig, I need to ask, you know, what are you seeing as far as innovative technologies that are emerging to sort of augment telemedicine?
It's a great question. You know, the driver here has always been to include telemedicine in our trials to reduce burden. And the survey that you shared, clearly the respondents in the lupus community are clear. They expect the research participation is going to bring some burden to them. And I'm not going to lie, it does bring some burden. And unfortunately, that burden disproportionately affects underserved communities that would otherwise struggle to take a day off from work and travel across town for a site visit. And so there had been a burgeoning momentum around telemedicine in trials for that reason alone. But to your point around the technology, we have to remember that in clinical trials, the reason why we're doing these is for measuring what we call endpoints. The endpoints are really the data that we're after to understand the efficacy or the safety of a new medicine. And if we cannot collect our endpoints, then it's hard to justify doing a study in the first place. But to your point around new technology, there's been a really active movement across the research community to embrace new uses of digital technology that can help to digitize and upgrade many of our endpoints, how we can measure with cameras or track movements with patients' permission and inclusion so that we can better understand activity and other types of data. Many large pharmaceutical companies are investing a great deal of technical and clinical resources to understand these new types of digital measures, sensors and wearables, and how we can validate those as new endpoints for our studies. When we are able to, we're able to start to see many more uses for telemedicine in our trials and start to create a future, Al, that really points to one of the last survey questions that you had there. How do we enable choice in how patients participate and let patients decide for a given visit, would they like to go to a clinic or can they stay home and do this online? To the example you gave earlier, Very often the patient knows if their foot is swollen and they need to go see the doctor. And right, and they can have that conversation with their investigator, but very often the patient knows. And so how do we start to envision trials in the future that start to give patients more choice in how they participate? We're in the early days around this. We're still getting our hands around using these technologies to ensure safety and the ability to get this data, but I think it's a good future lying ahead.
Well, that's terrific to hear. And you know, I think the obvious question that I have related to your responses, Craig and Dr. Karp, is how is industry practically sort of implementing or employing these new technologies and making them more effective in clinical trials to really minimize the in-person visits? And perhaps, Dr. Narula, you can talk about that a little bit, and then certainly, Dr. Singhal, I'd like you to elaborate as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key point was raised by Dr. Karp, is that we're in an intense period of learning about telemedicine, and that's true for clinical trials. I think this COVID pandemic is going to force a lot of learning upon us, and hopefully we'll come out of it a much more, much wiser about how to do telemedicine and to incorporate them into clinical trials. But I think there are some clear benefits to telemedicine for our patients in terms of their safety, their convenience, and that we can do a lot of the same things with telemedicine that we could do with in-person visits. That's the nice thing, and we have to capitalize on it. But I think it's finding the right balance, using telemedicine wisely and not overreaching. As has been touched upon, one of the key things we do in our visits in a trial is to make sure the patient is doing well and to ensure that the drugs that are being tested are safe and they're being tolerated okay. And you can get a pretty good history over by telemedicine, but as Dr. Karp mentioned, you really can't do a complete physical exam. So just to I think use these visits wisely to have the right follow-up visits, but to know when to sort of adjust and have the patient come in and be seen. That's going to be a key part of it. And then one other aspect about follow-up visits, as Craig touched on, is endpoints, and to what extent can we do assessments to make good choices there, that we do assessments that it's reasonable to do by telemedicine that don't compromise the integrity of the trial, but to realize where you really have to have have the patient and the trial come in and be seen in person. And I mean, there's some examples that have been touched on. It's pretty challenging to assess a swollen joint by telemedicine, but and skin rashes are tough, but maybe not impossible. I chatted with some investigators the other day who are now routinely looking at skin rashes via telemedicine, and it's more feasible when they're sort of restricted to a certain area and there's sort of a specific lesion you're following, but it's not impossible. So I think we'll just have to learn as we go and figure out the right path.
All right, terrific. Dr. Singhal, anything to add in this regard?
Oh, no, a lot's been said, and I think those are all very, very valid points. But I think in terms of why do we do visits, right? In a clinical trial, we see doctors for two things primarily: to make sure safety is being adequately measured and optimized, and to make sure that efficacy is being captured, to see the drug is safe and then effective. The effectiveness part sometimes can be harder with telemedicine in terms of physical exams, like it's been said, but safety can often be measured reliably with the combination of local labs and the patient knows best history through a telemedicine approach. Efficacy can be harder through the scores in lupus are very complicated. Things like SLEDAI, BILAG are very messy. Those can be harder to capture through a telemedicine visit. But the second part of that Dr. Narula was getting towards is the endpoints. And I think as we think of the FDA and the regulatory environment, our trials in the past have been very focused on what the physician knows best. Physician will measure you, the doctor will measure you, and he will tell you or she will tell you when the drug is working. But in the recent few days, I mean, if you look at a few years, the industry and the FDA is moving towards patient-reported outcomes, the PROs, and those are becoming more and more relevant. Those can probably be captured better through telemedicine than through doctor's visit. There is no pressure to a patient. The patient feels more at home. They can measure their state of health in the environment they are comfortable in. And those PROs are much better validated in this approach than through doctor's visit approach. So the world of endpoints may have to evolve as we move forward from the traditional clinical-driven endpoints to a patient-reported outcome. And telemedicine will thrive as clinical trials become more and more complicated, the diseases become more and more complicated, but the patient's voice needs to be raised higher and higher to see what works for them.
Well, I think what would be music to the ears of the people, the majority of the people on this webcast, and that's the people living with lupus, is having more meaningful clinical endpoints and clinical trials that are meaningful to them, right? And not, and that are real to them, right? What, you know, how do they feel? And I think if PROs can capture that, whether that's through fatigue or other measures, I think capturing clinical meaningful endpoints that are important to not only people living with lupus, but also are acceptable to the FDA with respect to getting new indications approved, I think would be a win-win for everybody. I want to just segue real quickly to sort of, and I think Chanel, you talked about this. We tried to have this webcast with a focus on sort of, you know, people living with lupus and becoming, I guess, re-entry into clinical trials in light of the pandemic. But I think you mentioned something that was very important, and that's sort of people getting involved in clinical trials to begin with, notwithstanding the pandemic. And the survey results showed that 83% of people with lupus actually feel more comfortable considering a clinical trial if they can talk with someone who has been in a clinical trial. And Molly, I want to start with you in this regard. You've been a major proponent of a program that Lupus Therapeutics and the Lupus Research Alliance has sort of put together, and we're actually studying now, that matches people who are thinking about a trial with a peer or a PAL, like we call them, a patient advocate for lupus, so they can talk to someone who's had critical clinical trial experience before. And as a person living with lupus, do you think such a resource is helpful, and why? And then I'd like to hear, you know, what Chanel's perspective is of that as well.
I love our PALS program. I think being provided a patient advocate would be a huge benefit to participating in clinical trials. They can give you firsthand experience and advice on making medical decisions, not only about your lupus, but also about the study itself. We encourage conversations with PALS about cultural diversity and the need to get more women and men of color into our trials. And let's be honest, women of color are 2 to 3 times more likely to get lupus, and that's something that we cannot ignore. All of our PALs at the 7 test sites have been trained in cultural sensitivity, and they're going to work to provide access to resources, not just about race, but your overall medical condition. The most important thing I think our PALs can do is when you're considering not continuing with the trial, we can remind you why you're there. You're not just there for your own health. You're there for the health of every patient with lupus. You are participating and taking our steps towards finding a cure one step closer. And I think that's something that you can be very proud of.
Thank you, Molly. And Chanel, so when you've come to the clinic and you have an exchange with your treating rheumatologist, and they sort of talk to you about clinical trials, and then you sort of go home and think about it. What do you think about the concept of having someone who is essentially a peer who's been through it? Have you had any experience in speaking with another lupus patient who's had experience in clinical trials that you can sort of talk about what it would look like, how it would feel, the advantages, disadvantages? And if not, do you think that's something that, you know, we should continue to pursue to have had that resource available to those who have questions about clinical trials?
No, I definitely think that that's a helpful way. I mean, I have myself participated in clinical trials before, and what made me do it were a lot of the things that Molly spoke about, just this idea of wanting something that's better, that might be a better treatment for me, you know, and knowing that there's something on the rise that would be a breakthrough for lupus patients everywhere. Being able to, have access to new therapies is, you know, that's an ideal. But also I think, yeah, definitely having other people, other individuals like Molly, like myself, or, you know, or other pals, which I love, by the way, styles would be really helpful, because it does seem really scary coming from, because sometimes I think the procedures are different depending on how the person found out about it. And as a person of color, there is that sensitivity that needs to be there, understanding the history of people of color and their distrust of a lot of the medical systems because of the history. And as we're moving out of that, the idea that like places are really recognizing that, and that that all these different places that are looking for participants of color are addressing that elephant in the room, is really a leading point for me as a person, or for like a friend of mine with a similar background, to want to explore more. And like I said, once again, the more you can find out, and I firmly believe in patients empowering themselves and trying to find as much information and asking those questions, and not being afraid to say, hey, okay, so what is this and what happens if this? I think that those, as much as can be onboarded by the doctors and the people participating, but also, having a pal help you and encourage you to do that as well. Hey, if you're a little unsure, feel free to ask questions. And also, to know that if for some reason you really don't feel like continuing, you feel like this is not for you, you also have that option too. And that's a valid space for you as well. I think that that's helpful.
Well, thank you, Molly, and thank you, Chanel, for sharing that. I think that's important that you share that perspective, and I hope people find that encouraging and comforting when they think about resources that could help them think through this journey. And I hope we'll have more to talk about with our PALS program over the course of the next several months, and hopefully beyond that into the coming years. Dr. Karp, related to clinical trials, notwithstanding the pandemic, what are some questions that patients should ask their rheumatologist when considering participating in a clinical trial today?
Well, I see this a lot because, as you know, I have a large group of rheumatologists who work for me here in Dallas, and so I rely on them to help recruit patients for our clinical trials, not just our industry-sponsored treatment trials, but our NIH-sponsored trials, trying to learn what we can do to prevent lupus in people who are at risk. And so I want them to be able to answer all the questions that patients might have. Is this going to interfere at all with any of the medicines that I'm taking? Is this the next best step for me? And I hope that rheumatologists are honest with their patients, that they don't lead them into trials that may not be the best thing for them. In most cases, people are offered trials because they need a new medication. They need something to try and help them get over a worsening disease course. But and so I want my patients, or the patients who come to me as a trialist, to have had that discussion with their treating rheumatologist first about what's going to happen to them in the trial, and is this the next best step for me?
Great. Perfect. Well, thank you, Dr. Karp. And I think, looking at the time here, we have 10 minutes left, and I think we've got a number of questions that have come in either through the online chat or through the registration of the meeting. And I want to sort of be fair and equitable with sort of sharing some of these questions, or posing some of these questions with the panelists. So Craig, let me start with you. Do you envision a scenario where conduct of some, but not all, lupus clinical trials are completely virtual? And how far away, in your opinion, is that horizon?
Al, I think there are some people out there that will say that today our trials are very much brick and mortar, and that there's maybe some middle ground where trials are hybrid with some visits to a site and some are online, and that maybe there's a future where trials are entirely virtual or online. I would challenge that thinking, though. I think that when I look at data, for instance, look at the data from health grades in the United States. The average physician rating in the United States is a 4.4 out of 5. Patients like their doctors in their life. Ask, online that you're looking for a new rheumatologist, and watch all your friends start to post, their feelings about their rheumatologists. My feeling is the problem is not to take people away from their provider in their life. The problem we want to fix is access and making research participation easier for patients. And so with that in mind, I think that we could create a future where these studies maybe could be done entirely in a remote virtual way, but I don't think that's fixing the problem that people really want. I think the solution that we have to aim for is how to open up as many doors as possible to make as many diverse, representative, and inclusive patients able to join in these trials from wherever they are in the country.
Oh, thank you. I think that's a great perspective, and I actually hope that that comes true. Dr. Singhal and Dr. Narula, I think that, Chanel and Molly both said something it's important. I think it's a question that I think it's important that we talk about. And that is, what approaches is industry pursuing to sort of increase participation of people of color in lupus clinical trials? Dr. Singhal, why don't you go first, and then Dr. Narula, you can follow.
This is an interesting question, because I think in a unique way, we're going through a very big experiment as a country in general. We have two big cultural clashes happening at the same time in this country. And in lupus, we have always struggled with recruitment of diverse set of patients, for patients of color and women in general. There's a lot of history behind this, as Chanel referred to. And I think in the very beginning, we've tried to tackle it head on. But I think if the COVID world has taught us one thing, now every common man I walk around with knows what a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4 trial is. Everybody knows what a placebo-controlled trial means. Everybody knows what a randomized controlled trial is. We've also realized how important being a part of a trial is, because trial-controlled data is far more valuable observational data. So as a country, we've become much more educated about trials. And I think the second movement has taught us how no one patient represents the entirety of our population. Diverse enrollment, diverse heterogeneous population represented in a trial represent the population of lupus. So these two movements are movements we need to capitalize on and leverage from. And I think the way we've done it is by engaging with patient organizations like yourselves to help us with that, by various minority groups out there that need us, that have expertise and boots on the ground to help us get our voices amplified. As an industry, we can empower patients, because we know a lot of patients struggle with access to high quality sites, and travel has been difficult. These at-home visits have boosted recruitment from centers and areas where normally we wouldn't recruit from, or we would struggle in recruitment from, because of the patient profiles being different sometimes in terms of just transportation issues and logistics being difficult. What we've also done is we've also been able to identify new sites that normally wouldn't have considered trials, but as being part of COVID trials, they've become experienced in trials and now want to become trialists, and they have the experience of wanting to do more than they've been doing in the past. So by opening up new sites, engaging patients with more diverse means, being more head up and upfront about the need for diversity and the barriers, and acknowledging the history of diversity, I think, I hope long-term those make a difference. These will take some time to show their results, but we hope they will.
Terrific. AJ.
Yeah, thanks. That was a really great answer by Dr. Singhal. So I just want to add a couple of things to it that, first of all, just to reemphasize that the point of your question is really important. We really have to do better to help patients of all backgrounds, get into our trials and to really treat everyone equally and help everyone have access to clinical trials. So that's a really important mission, not only to my company, but to, I think, everyone on this call. And we have to think about how to do this thoughtfully. I think one thing I learned, one thing that came through in the survey that sort of reemphasized what I've always known and suspected is we've not done a great job with communication thus far about clinical trials. I think the level of awareness of clinical trials is lower than it should be. The level of awareness, the specifics is much lower than it should be. And that's a failure on our part in terms of communication in the past. I mean, the fact that 3/4 of patients, who were surveyed didn't know that you could get a drug in development in a trial is striking, right? And so that just tells me we have to do a lot more to communicate better across the entire population and make patients aware of trials, but also to explain trials better. And I think that goes part and parcel with how we execute trials, that we look at the patient needs and help make a clinical trial a more, feasible and reasonable experience for a patient. So those are all things we have to strive to. I think when we think about the needs of minority patients, that's something I'm personally passionate about, as clearly others on this call are. And I think even though we can think about what all the barriers have been, clearly socioeconomic barriers have been there in terms of patients having the information about a trial or being able to get in a trial. And I think those are solvable things. And so hopefully, we as a lupus research community and as a society can address these together moving forward.
Well, I'd be remiss, Chanel, you brought this up at the very beginning, and you sort of heard sort of the responses from the folks on this call. What do you think should be done to enhance what you've just heard in this regard, as far as, bringing more people of color in lupus trials and just people in minority populations?
Well, I firmly believe that these different steps are a good step in the right direction. I think being able to speak to the thing is always just a great start. I think as we have a lot of conversations around diversity in multiple levels, not just patients, but also in clinicians, also in doctors, those are things that I know are conversations that are being had on multiple levels. So the population you are serving actually is reflected in the people conducting the trial. Those are things that are really, really important. Representation does matter. And continuing to really just try to really educate people on, the differences in a trial. What happens to the drug before it gets into a person's hands for a trial? Those are the questions that a lot of people have. And I think that, you're very right, Dr. Singhal, that there's a lot more conversation around it because we're looking at the COVID trials and we're like, what's on stage 4? Like, we're starting to have those conversations more. But I think trickling it back and letting that also go for all these other trials that do relate. And also, I've been a part of the observational trials, the observational studies. Those are so important as well. So I think that being able to have varied options for each patient is very, very helpful. And I think that that'll increase participation.
Well, thank you. I think we only scratched the surface of just clinical trials, and certainly clinical trials in a new COVID norm. And I hope we continue this conversation beyond this panel tonight, because I think it's important. And I think, the learnings from this are things that we can sort of move forward more fully and talk about as a community. So I wanted to just extend a thank you to our entire panel for your insights at this time when patient-centric clinical trials cannot be more important. We hope that this discussion has given a voice to all the different people involved in lupus clinical trials, the companies who design the clinical trials and who sponsor the trials, the innovators who are doing all they can to adapt to patient needs, the doctors who are trying to match patients with the right trials for them, and especially, and most importantly, the people with lupus who are the most essential to the success of all trials. It's quite possible that many of you may be wondering tonight how to get involved in a lupus clinical trial. You can start by visiting lupustherapeutics.org, our website, and our dedicated website, lupustrials.org, to get an idea of the types of clinical trials you might consider and which are near to your home. In addition, please visit the Learn from Lupus section by visiting lupusresearch.org, where you can view videos featuring people with lupus who have participated in clinical trials. We hope you will explore taking part in the clinical research process, however you feel works best for you. I'm stating the obvious, but there can be no treatments or cure without clinical trials, and there can be no clinical trials without participants. Finally, our survey is still open for you to provide feedback on reshaping lupus trials amid the pandemic and beyond. To take the survey, there should be a link in the chat box. We'll also be sending up a follow-up email to all email registrants. We hope you will participate in it and provide and allow us to augment the feedback that we've received to date. I wanted to thank you for joining us tonight, and I hope that all of you on the call enjoy the remainder of your summer and stay well and safe. Thank you.